that we're going to look at now. The front page of the Daily Telegraph, when I reviewed the paper's tougher powers of magistrates to clear trial backlog, writes the paper. And then the underheadline, Raab, as in Dominic Raab, announces historic sentencing reform, freeing up judges to deal with major crimes. Dominic Raab, that's of course referred to as the Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary, joins me now. What do you and your colleagues hope you'll achieve by this move? Good morning, Mr. Raab.
Morning, Nick. Well, look, it's part of our crime-fighting plan and clearing the backlog that we've had because of the pandemic. We've got the backlog in the Crown Courts down by 2,000 since the peak in June. I said it would take 6 to 12 months to start seeing that, so I think that's positive. Along with the £1 billion we're investing in the courts to get the cases running through more swiftly, along with the video technology, the Nightingale courtrooms, we're going to increase the magistrates' sentencing powers from 6 to 12 months. That will allow criminals to be brought to court and prosecuted faster. It will give justice to victims more swiftly, and it will reduce the backlog in the Crown Courts by an estimated 1,700. And it's part of, as I said, our wider crime-fighting plan, recruiting more police, increasing sentencing powers. Both of those Labour and the Lib Dems voted against. And just last night, we saw Labour and the Liberal Democrats in the House of Lords vote against our powers to stop Extinction Rebellion and Insulate Britain sabotaging under the guise of lawful protest by blocking the M25, stopping people to going from work, and in the case of Insulate Britain, stopping ambulances from getting to the sick.
It's interesting you mentioned that, and we'll return to your move regarding magistrates, but part of the compelling evidence that I heard from the House of Lords last night was the Labour Lord, Lord Hayne, suggesting that if this bill had been around at the time, we wouldn't have been able to have the suffragettes, we wouldn't have been able to have the anti-apartheid demonstrations. Is this now a nation that would rule out all demonstrations such as this, Mr. Raab?
No, I've always been a champion of peaceful protest, but I think most people and your listeners will understand the distinction between making your point vocally, strongly, ardently, and actually trying to interfere with people going about their lawful business. The huge cost to police in dealing with what is no longer just lawful, peaceful protest, but sabotage, gluing yourself, sticking yourself to infrastructure, and things like that, the damage it does to people's livelihoods, the economies, effectively trying to paralyse a major piece of infrastructure like the M25, and in the case of Insulate Britain, stopping ambulances getting to the sick. That can't be right. That's not a peaceful protest. That's sabotage. And we should call it what it is. And I'm very disappointed that Labour and the Liberal Democrats, including Lord Hayne, voted against it.
And it's coming back, of course, to the House. Also, I have to say, some former senior police officers describing it as outrageous. So one would suggest they might have working knowledge of this. It comes back to the House of Commons. To explain to my listeners, what happens now in the process of this bill?
Well, there's always that scrutiny. The House of Lords has got the right and proper focus on scrutinising, particularly things like the technical aspects of the bills. It will come back to the House of Commons and we'll vote on it, and we'll be able to call the cards of Labour and the Liberal Democrats. Are they on the side of our efforts to have tougher sentencing for violent and sexual offenders? They voted against it last time. And on these issues, will they stand for that important delineation between peaceful protests, which we all support, but avoiding and preventing it tipping into sabotage and the disruption of the public going about its ordinary life, its daily life, and public services doing their job.
You're not minded to alter it at all, Deputy Prime Minister?
We are altering it. I've come forward with a range of different measures. Tony's Law, which will increase the sentences.
But then it'll just get voted down again, won't it? What's the process there? If you put it forward again, won't they just vote it down again?
Well, no. Ultimately, the House of Lords, if we, as I hope we will, vote down the changes by the Lib Dems and Labour, we will have the House of Commons being very clear. It will go back to the House of Lords. We engage in what's called ping pong, but ultimately, the will of the democratically elected chamber must prevail.
OK. Just coming back to the work you want to do with the magistrates' courts, some legal experts have their concerns, and rather than me précis them, just listen for a few seconds, if you would, to Barrister Jeremy Dean, QC.
More people are likely to be sent to prison by the magistrate, and the prisons are already busting at their seams. Magistrates like to send people to prison. Lawyers are likely to advise their clients to elect for trial in the Crown Court, and I'm afraid that this proposal is liable to increase the backlog in the Crown Court, where the more serious cases are tried, rather than reduce it.
A response, if you would, Justice Secretary.
Well, I'm afraid that's a sort of a mutually contradictory argument. On the one hand, we're told the magistrates will engage in sentence inflation. Actually, the measure will come into force end of February, early March. We're taking that time precisely so the training is in place. But our magistrates have done an amazing job through this pandemic, and I do trust them with these extra powers. But if on the flip side we'll get more cases going to the Crown Court because they elect trial by jury, well, then that risk would be averted anyway. This is a smart,
How will that risk be averted?
Approach.
How will that risk be averted?
Well, if they go to the Crown Court, they won't be sentenced by magistrates.
But won't there be a backlog there? I think the point Mr. Dean was making is that, in a way, the backlog will be shifted from the magistrates' courts possibly to the Crown Courts.
No, the point of increasing their sentencing power is precisely for either way offences. Things like stealing a car, a fight that goes nasty in a pub, will be able to go and have proper sentencing in the magistrates' courts, and that will lift, we estimate, around 1,700 cases from the Crown Court. And of course, this is something that has been widely welcomed amongst the magistrates, but also the senior judiciary who we've consulted on.
All right, last couple of minutes with you, staying with legal matters. Were you surprised that Frank Lampard seems to have escaped any form of legal action despite being photographed driving his car, one hand clutching a coffee cup and the other a mobile phone? I note that you're a Chelsea fan, and I note that Mr. Lampard is the all-time scorer during his 13-year career with the Blues. But come along, Justice Secretary, this is a questionable decision, isn't it?
Well, forgive me if I let the police do their job based on the evidence and don't start weighing in on those sorts of matters.
You've no further comment on that? You're happy with the decision on that particular one?
It's not the question of whether I'm happy or not, it's that I respect the operational independence of the police.
Who are my listeners to believe over that party, the Prime Minister or Dominic Cummings?
I think the Prime Minister's been very clear that he believed in good faith it was a work event. He said that to the House of Commons. But as with all of these things, Nick, and we're several weeks into this, we take the charge of double standards very seriously. The Prime Minister does, made that clear to the House of Commons. And that's why Sue Gray is impartially investigating all of this. And I'm not going to comment any further. Her report will come back relatively swiftly now, and there'll be full transparency in relation to it.
There has been an apology from the Prime Minister. You might be aware that there has been photographs of the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, with a bottle of beer. I offered him 3 opportunities to apologise for the look of it, for the look that was presented by that on this show yesterday. Do you think he should have apologised?
Look, I think it just shows you the grotesque double standards. But I tell you what, if I'm really honest with you, Nick, what I care about more is that Keir Starmer is voting against tougher sentencing powers for dangerous sexual and violent offenders and standing on the side of saboteurs like Insulate Britain and Extinction Rebellion, not standing on the side of the law-abiding public.
Got to get a word from you in your role as Deputy Prime Minister. Concern over Ukraine, British deployment now of troops and kit. What are we seeing on the borders there? What is the greatest fear? What needs to be done, possibly by your colleague, Mr. Wallace?
We're obviously working very closely with the Defence and Foreign Secretary, and the Prime Minister is very carefully monitoring the situation. We are worried about the aggressive sounds and build-up on the Russian side of the border. We do stand with our allies and partners in supporting the territorial integrity of Ukraine and making sure that we can support them in defensive measures.
What would that support mean? If Mr. Putin were to order the divisions of tanks across the frozen landmass in the middle of this month into February, what would NATO's response be? What would be the UK's response as part of NATO?
Well, Ukraine's not part of NATO.
No, UK is part of NATO, though.
Yeah, but Ukraine isn't. So there's not a commitment to go to self-defence. But what there, I think, is.
So he'd just roll into Ukraine, would he, Mr. Putin?
I think there'll be very serious economic consequences for Russia. And what we would call on Moscow to do is dial down the rhetoric, scale back the intimidation, and engage diplomatically on the issues to avoid what I think would be a disaster for Russia, but also very damaging, of course, for Ukraine.
And lastly, it is reported by one newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, after they campaigned for it, military personnel will receive a medal for their partaking in Operation Pitting. That was, of course, the evacuation of personnel from Afghanistan. Were that to be true, would you welcome the news?
Absolutely, they did an amazing job with the Home Office officials, the Foreign Office officials. For all the challenges, an incredible job getting. I think since August, it was 15,000 people out, British nationals, Afghan workers, and other so-called special cases. The military, as always, did a fantastic job for us.
As ever, grateful for your time. Justice Secretary Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab appearing here on LBC, where at 1 minute after 8 news is next.